So let me start by introducing who we have here. We have Huiet Joseph, who is the Senior Manager of Sustainability and Engineering at Cox Enterprises. Next to him, we have Allison Richards, who is a Senior Energy Analyst for Time Warner Cable. Next to Allison is Rene Spee, Dr. Rene Spee, who is a Senior Energy Consultant for Coppervale. And finally, certainly last but not least, is Daniel Howard, who is a fellow and the former CTO of SCTE. So we're very, very happy to have you all here today. So here's how we're going to try to make this work. We have not had a problem with this crowd being interactive, and that's good. That's really the intent of this conference. So we do have T-shirts. I haven't seen, Pratik, I haven't seen you throw one yet, so I want to see you stretch your arm this time. I have a handful of questions here that I will use to try to get the discussion started, but what we'd really like to try to do is give you guys in the audience an opportunity to ask these guys up here some of their experiences and maybe some of the questions you would have about how they address energy management in their particular industry. So we'll get things started, and my mic guys will be ready to pop down and get questions from the audience. So I guess to start, the cable and telecommunications industry, it permeates thousands, millions of homes around the US. And because of its pervasiveness in our society, they really take on some of the most exorbitant energy expenses of any industry in the US. But in spite of that, the leaders in this industry are really refusing to allow their energy costs, the rising costs of energy or dependence on the grid, to prevent them from the success that they're after or get in the way or inhibit their growth and expansion of their business. And so we've seen some things come out of that, that resistance to succumbing to the challenges of energy management at an industry level. Things like the Energy 2020 initiative that's come out recently that we'll speak about, I'm sure, at some point in this discussion. So really what we're trying to do today is allow these experts here to provide some insight into some of the uniqueness that this industry has and some of the maybe different approaches towards energy management that are required to manage energy management, to manage their energy consumption and usage and costs within this giant industry. So I thought what would be good to start with is maybe have a discussion about some of the differences, some of the uniqueness around the cable operators' energy consumption and how they might have a little bit of a different pattern from some of the other industries, particularly because they do consume, billions of dollars on an annual energy spend standpoint. So, Daniel, could you maybe get us started with maybe some perspective on how this industry might be a bit different in the energy world?
Yes, thanks, Tim. I think one of the first points I'd like to make is that, yes, we have some unique challenges, but they're really unique to the telecommunications industry as a whole. It's not just cable, but it's also conventional, traditional telco providers, wireless as well as wireline. And just to make sure that everyone's nice and lively after the break, let me start with a quick poll. A typical cable network or telecommunications network in general has several major components. There's administrative offices, there's the backbone core network, hanging off of which is typically the large data centers that consume anywhere from 2 to 4 megawatts, for example. And then there's the edge facilities, and these are, in the cable network, these are called head-ends and hubs. In the telcos, they're called central offices. In the wireless network, it's called a base station. And then ultimately, the access network itself is either, in the case of cellular communications, it's wireless, but in telco, it's copper twisted pair. In the cable world, it's coaxial cable, increasing amounts of fiber, obviously, but that's the access network. So where do you guys think the biggest component, if you added up all the energy consumption and looked at the total energy bill that a cable operator or a telecommunications provider pays, how many of you think it's mostly in the administrative offices? Okay. How many think it might be in all of these massive data centers that are like 2 to 4 megawatts? Raise your hands high. Okay, good. That's about half of you. How many of you think it's in the edge facilities, which is the head-ends and hubs? In the telco world, it would be, okay, a few of you there. Well, guess what? We have a slide that'll give you the answer to that. If you add up the power combined from the edge facilities and the access network itself, which is in the cable world, it's the fiber optic nodes and the RF amplifiers. In the telco world, these would be either base stations or DSLAM central offices and so on. That's actually the biggest component. It's 73 to 83% of the total bill. Why? It's not because they individually consume so much energy. A typical edge facility is probably consuming about 100 kilowatts, 200 kilowatts, compared to 2 to 4 megawatts for a data center. But there's so many more of them. And worse, and this is where some of our specific challenges lie, is that they're old. A lot of these older head-ins and hubs have been around since the 70s. They're not particularly well laid out. The nice hot aisle, cold aisle containment and management of airflow that you see in a modern data center is absent. Sometimes the racks are not even in nice, neat rows. There's not blanking panels a lot of times on the racks. The equipment will vent side to side, and sometimes the output of one piece of equipment will feed hot air into the input of an adjacent rack piece of equipment. A lot of problems with energy efficiency. In fact, we did a study and found that the power usage effectiveness, the PUE, which is the ratio of total power consumed in a facility divided by the power just consumed by the functional equipment, in this case, telecommunications equipment. Ideally, you'd like to have that as close to 1.0 as possible, and in these modern hyperscale data centers, you can see like 1.1, 1.2. We're seeing it well over 2.0, and it's because the facilities are so old, the air handling is so antiquated, the placement of the racks, the equipment within the racks. So those are really a lot of our challenges. And for those of you who guessed it was the edge facilities and actually combine it with the access network, dead right. And if you have some ideas on how to help us with that, we are all ears, because that's the biggest chunk of our energy bill.
Great. Well, that's interesting. So hopefully you can get some perspective of how there is a bit of a different feel for where some of the energy savings measures might come from and how it is that you're going to address kind of changing the wheels on a moving car is not necessarily the easiest thing to do.
That's right. Services have to stay up. Whenever you're doing these changes or improvements, you don't want to, outages that cause customer dissatisfaction and then you lose them.
Right, exactly. Now, I know one of the questions, this was something that I had a question about, I'm sure the audience would be interested to hear a perspective on. There's been a lot of consolidation in the cable industry recently with AT&T's acquisition of DirecTV and Charter's acquisition of Time Warner Cable. How have you guys seen that affect either positively or maybe negatively the creation of new energy management initiatives within your organizations? And Allison, you'd be a good perspective here from Time Warner Cable. Can you give us your perspective on that?
Our perspective is that energy management is essential to our business. So regardless of what is happening in the industry, we have to keep going. We have to provide quality service to our customers and be more efficient at doing it. So that's above our, we keep that in the C-suite, and we just go on with day-to-day operations and make energy efficiency a part of delivering quality services to our customers.
Okay. So keeping it at that C-suite, I'm sure, helps facilitate a lot of the initiatives that do get underway. Now those C-suite executives might be overseas. There's actually been a lot of international acquisitions recently with Altice in particular, just recently acquiring Cablevision. So what do you guys think might be the impact of having this common cable energy challenge suddenly becoming a globally managed set of companies? So Rene, do you have some insight there?
Yeah, actually, I think you'll see more focus on energy management with some of the European players coming in. Back to a chart David had where he showed the cost in the UK. Actually, if you take a look, for example, at Germany or Holland, that's even worse. I mean, people are paying over twice of what you're paying in the US. On top of that, the Europeans are used to a much more stringent regulatory climate in terms of carbon, et cetera. So I think you'll get that mindset in here, and I think it will improve things a lot.
So potentially some of those CFOs that aren't so interested, because the cost isn't so much of a drastic problem here in the areas that it's not, it's a much bigger problem in other countries. Yeah. So that CFO might be a little bit more receptive. Okay.
And they've honestly, just to go forward with Rene's point, the European regulations have been around longer for energy efficiency. They actually imposed regulations on set-top box energy efficiency. They've been really blazing territory in data center efficiency, and there was something in the news recently about a new data center in France that got canceled because of noise, but then there was issues with energy that were brought up, and it's on their minds a lot. And the high cost of energy, the greater regulatory environment, and the fact that they've been doing it longer, I think is going to be a positive thing. Now, the other side of that is, you mentioned Altice. A lot of the things driving these consolidations in the industry is cost efficiency. That's a great thing because you have a larger scale, and things that don't make sense, for small companies can make sense for a larger company at scale. But on the other hand, what a lot of times drives the bottom line in these negotiations is free cash flow and all these typical financial sorts of things. And so the spotlight and sunlight on the bottom line and any costs that can be shaved and so on, I think that's actually a little bit of a distraction for us in moving forward with energy initiatives, because a lot of the folks we work with have been distracted during these acquisition phases. They got their normal day job, now they have the acquisition support and all the financial data they have to collect, and then they have their volunteer industry role to help move the industry forward. It's actually been quite a distraction, but I think it's temporary. It'll be gone in probably a couple of years.
Okay,
Things will
so
settle down.
Following on that, kind of getting the projects flowing and getting started, I know sometimes the problem is just getting the inertia to begin with at the start, and just getting kind of off the ground with a project specifically. Huiet, do you have any perspective on how kind of overcoming this initial inertia problem for getting projects underway?
Just in general, it really is, I think you mentioned cost. It's really about cost and benefit in terms of getting things going. And speaking the language of the finance folks, I think we talked about that a little earlier this morning on how do we combine these two different worlds of energy managers and finance folks. But what we've done at Cox is we've kind of figured out how to talk their language. And then once you start taking a lighting project and putting it in terms of dollars and cents and payback and impact to the bottom line, the projects begin to start rolling. Then you can focus more on the engineering piece and the energy savings piece, but you really have to sell it on the economics.
Okay, Allison, what are some things you've seen in how you get projects actually to be accepted and started there at Time Warner?
It's a little of the same. We have to speak the language of the financial folks, and so ROI, they talk about payback, how soon we're recouping on the investment. Because of the way our industry is set up, we have a little bit of play in that we do pilot projects. And so with or focus on reliability and uptime, we always try to test new technologies, not new technologies to the world, but new technologies to the cable industry. And so we've gotten some support in just piloting a couple alternate energy solutions to see what that impact would be on our operations. Do we have as much reliability in our data centers, in our systems with this new technology? So for example, we've piloted a geothermal system. We piloted fuel cells. So there is a little play while it has to, the focus is on financial return and energy savings, cost savings first and foremost. As green as I am, cost savings first and foremost. So yes, we have to deal with the triple bottom line. But yeah, in that instance, we were able to get a little more in terms of R&D for a wider range of solutions.
Okay, Rene?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to understand is, that there's the old saying that you can't manage or improve what you can't measure. And so one of the things we've seen in this space is that there's a lot of energy spending, but up until recently, it wasn't even understood that well. A large cable television company said, okay, I spend $50 million a year in the Northeast on energy. Done. You have to drill down, be very granular about it. And we've been working in this space for like 6 or 7 years now. Originally, the first project we actually did was in Europe, so it kind of came from there. But now, just this year, working with the SCTE, cable operators have sort of standardized it almost and said, well, in order to really improve, you have to do a baseline. And that really means you have to tackle all your utility accounts, understand spending, understand usage, and that forms the foundation for improvement and then tracking the improvement. And this is where it gets tricky. This is blood, sweat, and tears, because think about it. In our space, for every 100 customers, you have approximately, to keep numbers relatively easy, for every 100 customers, you have one utility account. So, once you have a smaller system with, 5 million customers, that's 50,000 utility accounts. You got to manage them. But once you manage them, then you can break it down into possible improvement projects, back to cost. You have projects that potentially require CapEx, CFO definitely involved. You have projects that you can pull through with operational expenditures. Yeah, CFO may not be involved if you can work with some of the technical people. But believe it or not, it's almost Christmas. Once you do this, there's actually free money. So when you do this baseline, whenever we do this, I find free money. And it's utilities overcharging at times, accounts that don't exist anymore, tariffs that can be changed. There's literally, the stuff pays for itself. So it's blood, sweat, and tears, but what you get out in the end, you get that great baseline where you can improve on, and it pretty much paid for itself, and you have some money left over at the end.
You have a comment?
Just one more thing before we move on. One of the things we've also sort of struggled with at Cox is that, as Daniel said, you have the choices of different buildings to go and do energy projects, right? So you have the administrative building, and you have these big complex data centers. Energy guys like myself who've been around sometimes, or even the new guys, they're very comfortable with making the administrative buildings really efficient. We know how to do that very well. But when we go in and we touch these highly complex cash machines of our business, it's almost we're a little bit scared of those blinky lights. So, and that's just being honest. I mean, we can go in and do a lighting project in these data centers, but that's the tail wagging the dog. It really becomes, how do you make that hot owl, cold owl change, and how do you maybe put chilled water into those sites and use that generator to generate peak demand or shave the peak demand. And those become much more complex. Those demand a higher level of involvement and technical capability. And they can be scary for finance guys who say, you're going to do what to my cash register? But we've been able to overcome some of that, and it's been difficult, but we're making great strides.
Yeah, and I'm sure
does-
one successful project can help lead to another.
It does take an education, because the folks out in those edge facilities are rated and graded in their performance on things like availability, service availability, capacity, efficiencies in delivering the service, not energy efficiency. And we have to educate them. It's, even though we have standards, Rene mentioned standards that are coming out of our program. We've had one, SCTE 186, that's been around for a while, and it talks about things like venting front to back and not side to side. Some of these folks in the, the regions and individual, small call centers, if you will, for pieces of the network, are still buying equipment that doesn't vent, that doesn't adhere to this standard and doesn't vent properly, because it's maybe $50 cheaper, and they're just focused on, how do I get the bottom line of my CapEx down without really seeing what they're doing to their overall cost structure. And that takes a culture change and an education across the workforce. Everybody has to see that it's beneficial to them to improve energy efficiency. I'd like to see those techs get bonuses and get some kind of reward for finding ways to make their facilities more efficient without spending a huge amount of money and without having to take services down in the process. They'll come up with these innovative ways if we incentivize them.
Excellent. So I've asked a handful of questions. I'm sure by now there's some out here in the audience. Before I go back to some that I had prepared before, does anybody have any specific questions that they'd like to throw out? All right, here's one up here. We get a mic here, and we'll have 1 second right here. Michael, you can be bringing one over to this
Hi, my name is Zach Sheelan. I work for the Cadmus Group, consultant to Energy Star. So related to Daniel's last point and one of Renee's points, with the savings that are born out of these projects, what happens to the free money? Is it getting reinvested into further projects? Like, is there some sort of mechanism for trying to use that to fuel further projects? Or not?
I
You'll have
wish.
to ask the CFO on that one.
Sometimes. The answer is sometimes. Other times, of course, they're just being driven, especially as part of all this, consolidation madness going on right now. Every bit of bottom line reduction and freeing up of capital and improving free cash flow is seen as a good thing, and then they're very hesitant to take pieces of that. But there's this is actually a good thing because it's driving us to consider completely different business models. One of the companies that's part of our Energy 2020 program is coming up with a energy savings as a service model where they put energy managing equipment into these head-ends, hubs, data centers, and they're actually paying for the capital equipment. But what they do is they charge the operator based on the energy savings. So they take a piece of the energy savings that they get. So this kind of innovation in the business model is an end run around the CapEx nervousness that a lot of cable operators have, especially in this consolidation era. But I think that's great. I think coming up with new ways to get the message across and get them used to saving energy, however we do it, those are all quills that we should have in the the arrows that we should have in the quiver for solutions to this problem.
At Cox, to give some more insight at Cox, when we go out and we find these gotchas and this free money or rebates or anything else that we track to try to support our projects, that's where they go. They go toward the financial benefit of that project. So they're not really, okay, I found $10, let me go do something else. They just go back to the company, and typically as either a revenue stream, if we're doing something with power or doing solar or fuel cells, or they go to support the project. That's typically what we do.
Same.
I think we had a question here as well.
My name is Carlene Smith Martin with Kellogg Company. First of all, I appreciate you guys' initiatives and effort in trying to preserve natural resources. My question is, do you guys have any numbers that you can say, we started out with a baseline of such and such, and from that we've seen a 20% increase, or on any of those huge projects that you guys talk about, all the different ones that you challenged? Do you guys want to share a couple numbers?
Sure. I mean, one example would be we just did a presentation at our show that we have every year where Comcast showed that in upgrading and modernizing their data centers, and the big deal is two things. One is modern server equipment that tends to be more energy efficient. They improved racks and airflow handling and so on. And then they specifically turned on and leveraged virtualization. And that allows you to be energy proportional so that you can power servers down when they're not needed. And a lot of the older systems don't do that. They actually reduced their energy consumption by 40%. So, but that involved a lot of capital, right? But the good news is they were going to do that anyway. So one of the ways that Rene and I in particular are trying to get the cable operators to be a lot smarter is recognizing that doing it just for the sake of energy efficiency is usually not going to succeed. But if you can couple it to a process of natural upgrading and refreshing of equipment and pushing fiber deeper toward the home and all these things that you're doing to the network to stay competitive from a service perspective, let the energy efficiency sort of ride along on the coattails of that. And by the way, in so doing, you'll actually reduce your energy consumption and improve your cost structure for energy significantly. So that's one of the winning ways that we found to do this is time it with things that are already going to happen anyway.
And in some cases, you can actually use the energy savings to kind of accelerate potentially an upgrade or a capital improvement project, which on its own it wouldn't have stood and you would have had the same inefficient equipment, but you can sometimes justify an acceleration a year or two by justifying it that way, which is also positive.
And competition is good. right? When when Google Fiber comes into a city, the cable operator, wakes up, does the Scooby-Doo ears, and decides, it's like, whoa, well, we're going to have to, increase the capacity of the network, push the fiber deeper, maybe do some fiber to the home. Fiber to the home turns out to be incredibly energy efficient, especially passive optical networks. This is just an inherently more efficient architecture for the network. But it costs a lot of money to run all that extra fiber. There's, you got to pay the utility companies for putting extra strands on the pole and all that kind of stuff. But if you can couple that to the push to be more competitive with the energy efficiency that comes along with it, you got a double whammy.
We've also done some things on the water side with humidification and changed out some things to be more, because that's part of our goals as well, and not just strictly electricity, but we're seeing, a good 30% reduction in water consumption and some of the humidification systems we've done, and changing out lights. And as I think, as Daniel said, as they move to new HVAC equipment, we go to the higher efficiency equipment instead of just the standard level equipment. So it's not going in and whole hog just cleaning everything out. It's little piecemeals, little incremental efficiencies, improvements that you're affecting the total bill, but you're making little steps at a time.
And we do have some numbers, some targets for our program, if you're interested in that. And we have, for example, our goal is within Energy 2020 refers to the year 2020, not the vision 2020. And by 2020, the goal is to have a 25% reduction in the cost of energy, a 20% reduction in the consumption, a 20% reduction in the form factor, the footprint, if you will, of our facilities, basically making them denser, because that makes them more efficient to cool, and smaller watts per or joules per bit, or kilowatt hours per terabits per second, which is the metric we use. And finally, a 10% reduction in our dependence on the grid. And those are the targets that we're now, all of these projects in this program are focused on achieving by the year 2020.
One of the programs we found success in is those large data centers that are hands-off. We've been targeting cooling efficiency. So going with free cooling. So our HVAC systems have the capability to, we turn the compressors off when outside temperature hits 40 degrees, and we bring the cool air from outside to cool our data centers. And so that saves us energy there. Hot aisle, cold aisle containment. So all the hot air goes in one and cool it, and all this fancy stuff that goes in. It's amazing, the technology that goes in when we're changing out equipment. So with technology increasing, our customers are always looking for higher speed internet. And so when we increase bandwidth, we now have equipment that we have fewer pieces of equipment. We have more energy efficient equipment that delivers this higher productivity, but uses less energy. And also one of our problems is space. So the larger equipment requires more cooling, they generate more heat, but they also take up space. And these data centers are massive, they're expensive to build. So we also look at how can we look at equipment that reduces our space requirement. And so we've had some successes there also.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question before we need to move on to our next session. We have down here in front.
Good morning. This question's for Rene. I'm John Fiello with Smart Energy Decisions. Daniel brought up a point that I'm very interested in, which is this whole idea of business model innovation to get infrastructure as a service support to roll out energy efficiency programs. In Europe, are there innovations like that that have allowed European companies to get more involved in this, or are they simply more focused on it and therefore willing to make the CapEx expenditure that Americans may be more reluctant to do?
It's generally the latter in Europe, so that they usually make their own investments. And actually, that model that Daniel was describing is industry-wide pretty much still in its infancy. And part of the reason is a reluctance by operators back to look at these data centers, these hubs, these head ends. This is the bread and butter. Just letting equipment that's not vetted and not maintained in there that's been the struggle. But that dam is sort of crumbling a little bit with the proper management.
It does scare them. You know, if you talk about coming in and putting in systems, smart systems that will, selectively power down things, and they're, gamers are very conscious of latency in communications, and if it takes, a handful of milliseconds to bring a server back up or a, CMTS back up, that's a killer. Right, so they're very nervous about things like that. It's not the same in the data center world, and we have the data center world too, with all the data centers we have. But the things that make sense to do there and the scale that you have do not always translate well. And the folks that manage these head-ends and hubs are very traditional and very conservative about the way they want to make sure the service stays up. It's a challenge, but we think it's a surmountable challenge. It just takes time.
And data.
And data. That's right.
And data. And data. Well, I think,
And incentives.
yes. I think that does wrap up the time that we have now, Eric. Isn't that right? We need to get back on track. So thank you so much to the panel. Everyone give them a big round of applause.